Hello, I'm a neuroscientist, and what that means is that I try to understand how the brain functions, but more importantly, I try to understand what goes wrong when the brain malfunctions. 15 years ago, I met an extraordinary person who changed many aspects of my career, but who also changed many aspects of my life. This person, her name was Kate. She lived in Cambridge. She was a 26-year-old teacher. When I say I met Kate, the circumstances of our meeting were rather unusual. She was admitted to Addenbrooke's Hospital in Cambridge, where I was then working, and she was admitted to the neurointensive care unit because she was in a vegetative state. This meant that her doctors assumed that she had no feelings, no sense of where she was, no sense of who she was or what had happened to her. My colleagues and I decided that we would put Kate in a brain scanner and see what would happen. We used a technique called positron emission tomography, or PET scanning, and while she was in the scanner, we showed her pictures of the faces of her family and her friends. Now, none of us predicted that we would see anything. She was supposed to be in a vegetative state. Her brain really should not have activated. But actually, when we scanned her, the back of Kate's brain lit up like a Christmas tree. In fact, the parts of her brain that we know are involved in seeing and recognizing faces were specifically activated. So although Kate appeared to be vegetative, at least one part of her brain was responding entirely normally in the same way that it would if I'd scanned any of you. But what did this mean? Does it mean that Kate was conscious and aware all the time and just trapped inside a lifeless body? Or did it mean that her brain was activating somehow automatically to the faces in spite of the fact that she was, as had been assumed, unconscious and vegetative? Now, when I met Kate, we had no idea what the answer to that question was, but I spent the last 15 years trying to solve that problem. And the reason why it's such a big problem is that it's very difficult for any of us to know that another human being is aware. And when I make that statement, I'm not trying to dig any deep philosophical questions about consciousness or awareness. I'm talking about just in pure practical terms. How could I know that any of you out there are conscious and aware? It turns out the only way I can know that is if you're both willing and able to tell me. A much easier question is, how can I know that you're awake? So when we think about consciousness, there's usually two components that we think about: awareness and wakefulness. When you think of somebody becoming unconscious, they lose wakefulness or they go to sleep, but also we assume they lose all sense of awareness of where they are and who they are. Wakefulness is very easy to assess because I can just look at you. If your eyes are open, then I know that you're awake. I can't look at you and know that you are aware. So how would I solve this problem? How would I determine that you were aware? Well, the only way to do it is to ask you. I'm going to do it now, just to demonstrate how important this is. I'm going to ask you all to do something, and I want you to answer the question. If you are conscious, please raise your left arm. Excellent, okay? Now we'll do it again. I'll make it a bit harder this time. If you are conscious, please raise your right arm. Excellent. Right. Now, on the basis of what I've just seen, I know that you are all conscious and aware. And that is because you've done what clinically we call command following. I issued a request or a command, and you responded with the appropriate action. And on that basis, I can categorically determine that you must be aware. Command following is clinically extremely useful and important. Most of you will have probably seen an episode of House or ER where the doctor grabs the patient's hand and says, "Move your hand if you can hear me." What they're looking for there is evidence of command following, because we know that command following and awareness go together. And let's go back to consider the case of the vegetative state. Now here's a very famous vegetative patient. And she's a very good example of why this is so complicated in this patient group. Now, vegetative patients do behave. They're not like coma patients who just appear to be asleep and do nothing. Vegetative patients are actually often quite animate. They move, they have what we call sleeping and waking cycles. They'll wake up in the morning, they'll go to sleep. But the critical and important thing is that they will never make any responses to any external stimulation. So you can't attract their attention by playing some music on one side of their body or trying to get them to look at something. They will never respond. That's really crucial to the definition of the vegetative state. Now think about the two things I've told you, and I think you'll agree we have a logical problem here. First of all, I hopefully convinced you that in order for me to know that you are aware and conscious, you have to perform an action, you have to command follow, you have to respond. And then, looking at vegetative patients, they cannot, by definition, make any responses. Is it not, therefore, necessarily the case that if a patient was entirely conscious, for whatever reason, but incapable of making a response, we would draw the erroneous conclusion that they were vegetative, despite the fact they may actually be entirely consciously aware? So how do we get around this problem? We have a patient group that can't respond, and therefore we can't really know that they're unaware. We assume they're unaware. In fact, vegetative patients are often referred to as wakeful but unaware. But it's really just an assumption because we have no evidence they are aware. It doesn't necessarily mean that all of them are not. We've used a different type of brain scanning technology to tackle this problem. It's called functional magnetic resonance imaging, or fMRI. And this technique, the patient is put into the scanner, and we try to use their functional scans, pictures of the functioning of the brain, to establish whether they are aware. And the principle that we use is actually quite a simple one. We get people to imagine certain tasks, because it turns out that if you imagine doing something, the same parts of your brain are activated as though you were actually doing that thing. A very good example of this is arm movement. If you move your arm like this, or if you imagine moving your arm like this, the same area of the brain will be activated. The way we get people to do this is we ask them to imagine playing a game of tennis. It's just a very simple way of getting people to do something like that in the scanner, or imagine doing something like that in the scanner. You can see I'm not a very good tennis player. And what this does is it activates a part of the brain called the premotor cortex. It's right here on top. It activates in absolutely everybody when they imagine playing tennis. Now, it's not that we're activating the tennis playing area of the brain. We could have used all sorts of other sports, as long as the sport involves waving your arms around, or in this case, imagining waving your arms around. Now, fMRI is a tremendously powerful technique. What you're looking at here is not a cartoon. This is a real person's brain. This has been imaged and rendered in 3 dimensions. As you can see here, we can even cut the top of the head off and look inside at the brain activating. And we use that to get people to command follow with their brain. In this case, imagine playing tennis to command. And when you ask them to just relax, to stop imagining playing tennis, this key activity in the premotor cortex disappears. And really, this is command following. It's just like asking somebody to raise their arm and lower their arm, but we're asking them to activate their brain and then stop activating their brain. So would it work in a patient? Well, a few years ago, we came across a woman who had been involved in a road traffic accident, and she had been in a vegetative state for several months. She was absolutely characteristic vegetative state. She had not produced any form of response to any external stimulation. When we scanned her and we asked her to imagine playing tennis, her brain lit up in exactly the same way as healthy volunteers who were imagining playing tennis. Despite the fact that she performed there was no external evidence that she was actually conscious, she could activate this part of her brain. And she did this over and over again. Whenever we asked her to imagine playing tennis, this area would light up. When we asked her to relax, that area would diminish in activity. So we thought, well, can she do other things? Another task that psychologists often use, or cognitive neuroscientists if they're scanning, is called spatial navigation, getting people to imagine moving around a familiar environment. Now in healthy volunteers, as you can see here, this activates a completely different network of the brain, mostly in the back, involving the parietal lobe and an area deep within the brain called the parahippocampal gyrus. When we asked our patient, who again appeared to be entirely vegetative, to imagine moving around the rooms of her house, all of the same areas of the brain activated. And again, she could do this time and again. Whenever we asked her to imagine moving around the house, this is what we would see. When we asked her to relax, this activation pattern disappeared. Now on this basis, we concluded this woman wasn't vegetative at all, despite the fact, all appearances to the contrary. We concluded she was entirely conscious. And the reasons why we felt justified in doing that is because she's command following. This is exactly like asking her to raise her left arm and raise her right arm, as I did with you at the start of my talk, except here we're saying activate the premotor cortex or activate the parahippocampal gyrus. She can do it just as reliably as you all raised your arm. Over the next few years, we started to scan as many patients as we could using this very simple technique. And after 23 patients, it was apparent that about 17% of them, 17% of the patients who appeared to be entirely vegetative were in fact not vegetative, but conscious and able to produce these actions, albeit brain actions, in the scanner. So what we then went on to ask is, well, could we communicate with one of these people? Could we actually use this technique to communicate with somebody and ask them questions? And I'll illustrate the technique here with a healthy volunteer, and then I'll show you what happens in patients. So it's very simple. All we do is we say, well, if you want to say yes, imagine playing tennis. This is a healthy volunteer who told me the names of some of her relatives, and I had to guess, based on her brain activity alone, what those names were. So this is what happened when I said, is your husband called Charlie? No activity at all in the premotor cortex. But this is what happened when I said, is your husband called Terry? Small amount of activity, but it's in exactly the right place. The premotor cortex is activating because she's imagining playing tennis. She's trying to convey to me a yes, and indeed her husband is called Terry, and I was able to correctly guess that based on her brain imaging alone. Now, if you're sceptical about this, you may think, well, perhaps it's an automatic response. Perhaps just hearing a husband's name sets off some automatic brain activity. Well, that's why we have control conditions. We know that can't be the case. If we ask you, as we did with her, is your dog called Terry? The same name. This is an automatic response. The name Terry should activate the same regions, and absolutely nothing happened. And of course, in the fourth condition, is your dog called Charlie? The whole of her premotor cortex activated because her dog is called Charlie. Now I know what you're thinking. I don't know either why she had so much more activity to her dog than her husband. That's really a question for a social psychologist, I think. So last year we came across a patient who had been in a vegetative state for 5 years. He had been seen on multiple occasions by different doctors, all of whom had diagnosed him as being vegetative. He had never produced, at least since his accident, he never produced any responses to any form of external stimulation. When we put him in the scanner and we asked him to imagine playing tennis or to move from room to room in his house, we saw these characteristic patterns of activation that were quite different. So then we said to him, well, why don't you imagine playing tennis for a yes and imagine moving around your house for a no? And we'll ask you some questions and see whether you can communicate with us. We had to ask him questions that we didn't know the answer to. We obviously wanted to be completely unbiased here. But we also had to ask concrete biographical questions that we could verify the answers to later on. So we had a series of questions that were provided by his family. We didn't know the answers, and one of the questions was, is your father's name Thomas? And what we saw when the patient attempted to answer this question was a pattern of activity that hopefully you agree, looks almost identical to the pattern that is associated with him moving from room to room in his house. He was conveying a no. It was a categorical no. On the other hand, when we changed the question only very slightly, and we said, is your father's name Alexander? We saw a pattern of activity that was almost identical to the pattern that we see when somebody imagines playing tennis, and that's the thing that we had asked him to do in order to convey a yes. This patient was able to produce 5 responses in a row like this. 5 questions were asked and 5 questions were answered correctly. We independently verified that afterwards. Now clearly this patient isn't vegetative. He's clearly entirely conscious, and he knows who he is, and he knows something about his life. Now clearly, just because he can answer yes and no questions doesn't necessarily mean that it tells us a lot about his mental state. We don't know whether he's happy or he's sad, or whether he wants to live or whether he wants to die. But what we've done is to generate a system that can allow us to ask him those questions. And as long as the answers can be delivered as either a yes or a no, we can basically ask patients like this any question that we might want to know the answer to. I'm going to end by telling you what happened to Kate, the patient who started this whole area of work. Kate was unusual for many different reasons, and not least because she was one of the few patients who made a remarkable recovery. Kate is still severely physically disabled, but cognitively her brain is completely restored. She's very aware of what's happened to her. She's even got a very well-developed sense of humour, I'm happy to report. Her speech is very impaired. She is able to communicate with people that she doesn't know very well by using a letterboard. She points to letters, and in that way it's possible for people to understand what it is that she's trying to say. But of course this means that Kate can use a computer. And Kate does use a computer. She very frequently emails members of the team that were involved in her scan. I'm going to finish by reading to you an email that she sent to me recently, because I think it sums up Kate's feelings about this work, and I think the feelings that most of us have. She said, "Dear Adrian, I saw you in the local newspaper last night. I agree with you about brain scanning. It is so important. It scares me to think of what might have happened if I had not had mine. So please use my case to show people how good they are. I want more people to know about them. It was like magic. It found me." I've been a neuroscientist for 20 years. I've been using brain imaging for most of that time, and I can honestly say much of it still feels like magic to me. Thank you very much.